Welcome to the ETF's Learning Connects live session. Today, our focus is on work-life balance, inclusion, and skills development. Is there a connection between them? Can developing people's skills make a difference to their well-being? Are different approaches needed according to gender? And what is the situation in the European Union, in the European Union's neighbouring regions? And how can we inform better policymaking? To answer these questions, let's welcome our guests today. We have Daphne Nathalie Ahrendt, Senior Research Manager, Social Policies from the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. Welcome, Daphne. We have Outi Kärkkäinen, Senior Human Capital Development Expert and the focal point for gender of the European Training Foundation. Welcome, Outi.
Thank you, Denise. Nice to be here, and hello to everybody online.
Thank you. And I am Denise Loughran, your host for today, ETF's Communication Officer. We are live on Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, and Twitter. Before we get started, I would like to give a warm welcome to you, our audience. Thank you for joining us today. Please write in the chat, let us know where you're coming from, and post your questions, which we will present to our panel. So let's get started. Let's start with you, Daphne. Could you introduce yourself, tell us about your work, and tell us what are the main issues the European Union is facing with regard to work-life balance, well-being, and inclusion?
Yes, I can, certainly. First of all, thank you for the very nice introduction and, of course, also for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to take part in today's discussion. So you asked me to introduce myself. You already introduced my organization in the long way. My name is Daphne Ahrendt. I'm originally from the Netherlands, but I currently work in Eurofound, and that's based in Dublin, in Ireland. And Eurofound, we are a tripartite agency of the European Union. There are many other agencies. We're one of them that's based in Dublin, and our task really is to provide knowledge to policymakers to assist them in the development of better social, employment, and work-related policies. I myself work in the social policies unit, and a lot of my work consists of fielding and analyzing surveys mostly among the general population. And what we do is we examine different aspects of quality of life, and that includes well-being, inclusion, and work-life balance. So that's a little bit about what I do. Mm-hmm. And then if you ask me what the main issues would be that the EU faces in terms of well-being and inclusion, I would say at the moment, it's the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, which you would expect me to say, but also the war in Ukraine and the increase in the cost of living that everybody's experiencing at the moment. And all of these really have a big impact on people's lives. So we see that people's mental health was affected because of the closing of society due to the pandemic, but also because of worries that people had because they lost their jobs. Now they're struggling with their bills, and then there are all the pressures at home, trying to juggle work and care at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction, Daphne. I'll pass to Outi now. Outi, if you could introduce yourself and your work, and linking with what Daphne has just presented to us, what the connection is with education, skills development, inclusion, and also, of course, gender, given that you're our focal point for gender here at ETF.
Thank you, Denise. So like you said, I'm the gender focal point at the European Training Foundation, where I've been working for quite some time now. I've worked almost all my career in EU external aid, cooperation and development, specializing in gender. What I would like to maybe emphasize that is that the difference between the two agencies, the sister agencies, Eurofound and ETF, is that Eurofound, for those who don't know among the audience, is that Eurofound works mostly on the EU member states, while ETF's mandate covers the European neighborhood, the enlargement, and Central Asia. So this is how our competencies and let's say complete each other, because we cover different regions in the same thematic field. Currently, I'm doing a secondment to UNESCO, so I'm connecting from Paris. There were some hiccups with the connection at the beginning. I hope it will stay stable for the rest of the time. But coming to your question, Denise, if we consider the overall social inclusion as a process of getting everybody on board, ensuring that opportunities are the same for everyone, regardless of background, ethnic origin, sex, language, and so on, to really achieve full potential in their life, we can say that the task of education for inclusion, so part of this social inclusion process, is to, first of all, equip.
Oh, well, I think there's a slight pause now, Outi. I hope you can rejoin us quite quickly. In any case, Outi, when she rejoins, I hope. Ah, yes, you're here, Outi. Yes, we can see you.
Did you lose me?
Just for a brief moment, yes.
I don't know for how long time I've been speaking without being online.
No. It was only a moment that you weren't.
Only a moment.
Lost you. Just the last moment, yes.
Okay.
So if you can.
Well, anyway, the issues that Daphne just mentioned, to link with her, that are facing the EU and the neighborhood, they also existed before COVID-19, the pandemic. But let's say that they now higher in the agenda because the crisis, the pandemic, made the situation even worse. But what the pandemic reminded us is that where structural inequalities exist, they tend to be further deteriorated during crisis. And we know that those who paid the highest price for the pandemic were youth and women, but let's not forget it's also all those who were already deprived and countries that were already less developed. So while in the EU, we now see that there's a, let's say, good recovery and even a shortage of workers in terms of employment, ILO has estimated that the employment deficits persist in the low-income countries, that it's the high-skilled occupations that have experienced the strongest recovery, while the low and medium-skilled occupations, including services and sales, they remain at the 2019 level, and that the biggest growth for employment in the post-crisis situation, if we can say so, is in the informal economy, in the middle and low-income countries, in particular for women. Now, turning to the second part of your question, I hope you still hear me and I'm still online.
Yes.
Regarding the gender equality and well-being and work-life balance, we can see some gender differences both in the EU and the EU neighborhood that we discovered through the survey that we implemented together with Eurofound. So regarding the workload, for example, men work about 42 hours per week and women only about 37 hours a week. This is more or less the same in both regions, EU and EU neighborhood. But if we sum up this with the unpaid household and care work, which is about double for women compared to men, women work almost 100 hours a week compared to about 77 hours for men. So there's a gap of 25% gender gap. And this is worse in the EU neighborhood. And what comes to work-life balance, can you hear me?
Yes, fine,
Yeah.
yes.
What comes to the work-life balance, the working in free time is quite common in both regions and more common in the surveyed EU neighborhood countries. And work in free time increases both for men and women with children, but this is important. It increases more for women, and particularly for women who have small children.
Yes.
So in terms of well-being, this results in more often reported tiredness and stress by women, and in particular in the EU. So teleworking is said to be a solution for flexible working and for combining family and professional life, and helping the work-life balance. And indeed, in both regions, slightly more women do telework. And when women telework, they also tend to work proportionally more hours out of the total working time in teleworking. And surprisingly, but maybe as an indicator of the sharing or non-sharing of the burden, on average, men with children under 18 reported less often teleworking than men without children, while this is the contrary for women, both in the EU and the EU neighborhood. So women work more hours than men in a week. They do more teleworking when they have children, but they also work more overtime, so work in their free time, indicating that sort of the survival strategy of women to cope with both work and family responsibilities is really to stretch out the maximum of their capacities. And we also know, however, that the teleworkability is more common in medium or high-skilled occupations and among the tertiary educated. So we could guesstimate that as such, education and skills alone do not help for the work-life balance in any way, almost contrary. And the last point, then I give the floor to others in order not to dominate the discussion. I think that we also need to pay attention to the long-term effects of teleworking, what it means for career opportunities and progression. It needs to be something that both men and women use to balance and better combine private and working life to avoid long commuting times and so on. Otherwise, we risk to put women, if it's specifically their choice and their option, further away from the equal opportunities in working life.
Okay. Thank you, Outi. I mean, it's a very interesting topic, and I'm sure that many of our viewers will identify with the issues that you are highlighting. Before turning to Daphne to find out a bit more about that survey and what the EU is doing about those results identified, I will take a moment to say hello to our audience, those who have joined us online. We have Liliana Markovic from Croatia. Hi, Liliana. Thanks for joining us. We have Efrem from Indonesia, Angelina from Portugal, and Lakhdar from Algeria. So thank you very much to you for joining us. Please do post your questions, and our panel will be happy to deal with them. In fact, I see that Lakhdar has already just posted a question. So I'll just turn to Daphne now. Daphne, following on from all those issues that Outi raised, can you tell us a little bit more about these findings and what specifically the EU is doing about this?
Sure. Well, first of all, I think what Outi just said is so important to discuss, because the consequences are really quite far-reaching, and I think teleworking, it was really seen as sort of this panacea for a lot of the problems, but we have to be very careful. So, I think on the one hand, yes, it improves work-life balance and it gives people more autonomy. But I think Outi already said we saw from the survey that people were working longer hours. There's also the risk, I think, of becoming isolated. And then, there's this unfair distribution between men and women. And it also depends on what kind of jobs people have, whether they are even teleworkable. I think at EU level, there's a lot of attention that goes into this issue. For instance, the European Parliament, they have called for legal regulation on the working time of home workers, so of teleworkers. I think particularly to make sure that people can disconnect outside of working hours, that you don't keep working constantly. So having said that, I also think it's relevant maybe to go a step back, and Outi already mentioned that the two agencies complement each other very well in the coverage of countries. And that's what made our survey so interesting. I think it was one of the first surveys where we covered both the 27 EU member states, but then also the countries that the ETF covers. And I also think it's worthwhile to say that we have a new survey coming up in April, where the number of countries is probably going to increase. So we had 10 countries from the ETF, will go probably to 16. And what the survey covered was really a broad range of areas related to our discussion today. So we looked at work-life balance, we looked at well-being, we looked at work, we looked at telework, whether people were able to telework. We looked also at, now I can't think of the many questions that we considered. General well-being, the risk of mental health problems was very important. And then financial concerns were very much covered, because it was also fielded just at the time that the inflation began to increase. So I'm sure on our next survey we'll find even more worrying results
as a result of that. In fact, Daphne, I'll use this opportunity just to ask you a question that Lakhdar from Algeria has put, and it's talking about the impact of the COVID-19 and gender in particular, and he refers to what about families that have lost a parent, so even like a single parent. I mean, these difficulties are surely exacerbated. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think it's a very good point that he makes. I mean, we know, Outi also kind of referred to it, that one of the groups that were hit most were women, but then even more single parents. I mean, and they have always been a group that's probably often at risk. And so I think it's very important that the EU pays attention to that, and then that policy is also extended to other countries. What I have chosen to highlight as one of the examples of what the European Union is doing is this European pillar of social rights. And without going into too many details, I think it's a nice reference, because the aim of this pillar is really to make the EU, the European Union, a more fair place, and a place where everyone is meant to have equal opportunities, a society that's inclusive. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done to achieve this. And I think one of the concerns we have is that particularly now with the war in Ukraine, we're shifting our focus again away a little bit from the work that needs to be done to make the society more fair.
Okay, thank you, Daphne, for that overview. And indeed, I would just like to say to our audience that we're posting links in the chat of both of the survey undertaken jointly by the Eurofound and ETF, and just now a link to the European Pillar of Social Rights. I'll move to Outi now. So if we go back to the issue of, gender and equality and the issue of skills. I mean, okay, you mentioned to us earlier that skills development contributes to enhancing equality, but it's not enough by itself. I mean, could you elaborate to this point with some examples, maybe if you have them from the ETF's partner countries and the neighboring regions?
Just before I answer your question, Denise, I just wanted to add something to what Daphne said, indeed, about the work-life balance initiative by the Commission within the European Pillar of Social Rights. Because I think it's a good one in the sense that, as an initiative, let's say the implementation, in the sense that it's not only to promote teleworking, promote this and that. It also aims to encourage the better sharing of the care responsibilities between women and men. So, for example, the proposal for this directive on work-life balance, I think it includes also a proposal for extending the parental leave.
Yes.
4 months, but also making 2 months of the 4 months non-transferable from one parent to another. So basically making it an obligation to share the burden. Just to add what we mean in practice by this kind of initiatives at the EU level. Well, for the moment, it's a proposal, not a directive.
Okay. Well, Outi, then I would just say, since I've asked you to talk about the EU neighbourhood, and how then, would you think that this could inform, let's say, policies, approaches in the EU neighbourhood, where, of course, there are surely a number of differences, even cultural, social, perhaps, or not? What do you think?
How the EU policies could inform, and I think we can take some incremental steps and provide policy advice on the basis of the knowledge, the research and knowledge we have, also through our survey. I, at the same time, agree that we need to take into consideration the different contexts. We covered now in this survey 10 EU ETF partner countries. We will extend it in the next round. And we need to understand, for example, that the informal economy is much more important in a certain number of these ETF partner countries. So, for example, concepts of work-life balance. What does it mean for somebody who has never had a working contract that defines your working hours?
Yes.
What does it mean for somebody who's working always when she or he has an opportunity to sell something on the market? When the mother takes the kids to the marketplace to sell the things with her and work with her, if we ask her, do you have enough time for your family? Yes, they always with me, my kids. I mean, so in that sense, we need to pay attention to just transposing ideas of work-life balance where even the concept of holidays is not so clear-cut. And I'm thinking also beyond ETF partner countries to sub-Saharan Africa and other parts of the world. But now coming back to the gender equality through education skills.
Yes.
Certainly, yes, we know that gender and that the education of girls and women have positive impact not only at individual but also family and society level. in terms of birth control, children's education, health, poverty alleviation, and so on. So it certainly contributes and is crucial for inclusion and more inclusive societies. And what we see globally, not only EU or EU neighborhood, is now the reference is that there are a number of challenges for women to access and complete the quality education and training, and to then transition to decent employment. And women are more likely to work in vulnerable employment, informal employment, family work. And so there are like educational disadvantages that accumulate throughout the woman's life, both in EU neighborhood and other countries globally. Occupational segregation remains a feature of training and labor markets, limiting women's choices and confining them in lower paid and lower status jobs than men. So what do we mean by gender equality through education and training? We mean both, first of all, two education. So everybody, both men and women, should have equal access to education, equal opportunities in the education. So education, quality education without gender biases, stereotypes, gender stereotypes in the learning material, in the teaching methodologies, female-friendly and male-friendly learning environments in terms of infrastructure, security, transport. And then true education, the equality through education. So preparing both men and women for the labor market opportunities and the use of their full potential and capabilities.
Okay.
Now, so what I just wanted to say is that, okay, this is without forgetting the reverse progress that COVID had on girls and women's, or especially girls' education. We know that many girls got out of school. We know that educational attainment around the world has improved enormously, and in particular in primary education, there's almost a parity reached. And in many countries, the education level of women starts being higher than men's. However, if we look at the example countries of the survey, in the EU countries and EU neighborhood countries, more women than men graduate from tertiary education. Now, however, in the EU, the pay gap persists, and the female labor force participation rate is on average 15% lower compared to men. And in the EU neighborhood, the rate of women is lower than men's, again, in all the countries, raising in some countries to a gap of 40%. So, notwithstanding the educational levels, the gender gaps continue in terms of activity, employment, unemployment rate, and pay gaps persist. So, to put it very simply, educational skills help to enhance equality, but that's not enough.
Yes, thank you, Outi, for that point. I mean, it's really incredible if you think. I mean, I would imagine that, more skilled women, then they have a greater. They can contribute more to their work-life balance. They can contribute more to society, equal opportunities. But it takes more than education and skills, as you highlight. And I'm actually. Just before I ask Daphne for her input on that critical point, I will say hello to some others who have joined us. We have Vanessa from L'Aquila in Italy. We have Nintai from Cameroon, and we have Nebosha. I'm not exactly sure where Nebosha is joining us from. So welcome. Please post your questions in the chat. We're delighted to hear from you, and also from your own countries, any specific examples you'd like to share or questions. Daphne, turning to you now, we've heard from Outi that we have seen from this survey in the European Union, in the neighboring regions, that, higher education or more education and better skills, it doesn't always pan out that women have better jobs, better paid, better work-life balance, more included in society, then we could say. So what can be done? I mean, how can we ensure that results of a survey like this and other research, academic research, for instance, that it informs policy, but not only just informs, that policymakers act and do something about this?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. And I think there are still deep-rooted stereotypical sort of obstructions that prevent us from reaching that equality. So that's not quite answering your question. I will answer your question, but I think that's something where we can learn also from the EU that even if you have lots of policies, you still have to break these stereotypes. And how you do that, it's not that simple. I mean, we also have seen that quotas don't necessarily always work. So you really have to get everyone on board. And it starts with education. I think it's very important to start with education. But I also fully agree that it's not that somewhere you reach this kind of ceiling, and that ceiling is also there in these very modern European countries. I come from the Netherlands, and the Netherlands is a country where women tend to work part-time. It's the part-time working women working country. So of course there's a lot of national work that's being done to also change that, but it's so deep rooted that I'm even surprised anecdotally when I look at younger women that then repeat that pattern. They will have gone to university, they will have had lots of opportunities, and somehow along the line things go differently. Without hijacking the discussion, I think it has to do with pay. So the EU is now doing a lot of work to make sure that there is equal pay, but there still isn't equal pay. So then when families struggle with juggling responsibilities and with trying to make ends meet, decisions come, it's often decided that the woman starts working less. So I'm also very pleased to see this work-life balance directive now sort of enforcing that it's not a package, but the men have to take leave. So that's sort of one side of the coin, that you have to break these barriers that exist in society. Then when it comes to making sure that this knowledge reaches our policymakers, I think in essence that's the work that these agencies have as their core mandate. If you look at what we have to do, and I did look up our founding regulations, and they're from 1975. Okay, they're old, but they still count for today. So we have as one of our core tasks to enhance and disseminate knowledge, to provide evidence and services strictly really for the purposes of policy making, and to provide sort of these research conclusions. But I think if we listen to today's discussion, it's so important that this information reaches the policymakers. And we really try to do our best. And it's a discussion that even at Eurofound we frequently have. We need to also modernize. So, and the pandemic taught us a lot how we can reach people. But I always think the surveys are very useful because they also provide information from the ground, in a way, from the citizens themselves, from the actual situation. So I do think they play an important role, and our task is to make sure that the results get disseminated and reach the right people.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. And I have to say also this report we have published the link in our chat. I mean, it's really a good report, well written, easy to understand, and I think it will definitely appeal to a wide audience. I think it's a nice moment to read a comment from Ephraim. Thank you, Ephraim from Indonesia. So he thanks you for the discussion, and it's about, he says, raising these issues sets up a ripple effect of making people aware of gender issues, inclusion, and start the slow process of breaking down the bias and negative cultural thoughts. Thank you, Ephraim, for that that point. And now I turn to Outi, actually, with that introduction by Ephraim. So Outi, if we think of successful policies, Daphne has highlighted how important it is that research and surveys like this, which really capture what's going on in societies on the ground, and to feed this into policy and to policymakers. So thinking specifically then of gender equality and skills development, what for you are the successful components, the successful policies that draw upon? What do they draw upon?
Well, first of all, I agree very much with what Daphne was saying about the change that is needed, and what Ephraim from Indonesia said about this ripple effect, what we need. I think we can say everything about the skills policies, but we need the holistic approach. We see that the education, higher education, skills levels acquired do not translate to or guarantee the same possibilities for women, equal opportunities when it comes to working life, career prospects, work-life balance, to reach their full potential. The gender needs to be included in also in the other policies, whether that's economic and trade policies, to not to influence negatively by fiscal expenditure.
Oh, we've just lost Outi slightly. Come back to us, Outi. Okay, we hope. Yes, okay. We're back, Outi. Just for a split second, we lost you.
How long is a second? Is it a second?
Not even a microsecond, but
a microsecond. Okay.
Yes.
So I was saying that this holistic approach is necessary, because focusing only on the skills policies doesn't help, because a skilled woman cannot use her capabilities in the labor market if there's no structure for childcare or elderly care, if there's no women-friendly public transport available to go to work, if she's afraid of gender-based violence outside the work or even at the working place, if she's overwhelmingly exposed to health risks like contracting COVID, like what we saw in the first months of COVID around the world, that it was mostly women workers in health that contracted COVID, starting from, including Italy, by the way. So we need a holistic approach. And the second point is that we need an education and training system, skills development system, that is not only gender responsive, so tries to address the consequences of gender inequality by providing better skills, and then sending young girls and women to conquer the world. But it needs to be gender transformative and work on the root causes of the inequality. So I think education and training system has a mission, because we've seen that the sort of traditional and gender sensitive methodologies, they tend not to, when they treat only the consequences, they tend to fail in a way if you don't treat the structural causes of gender equality because of the gender norms, roles, also structures that limit the aspirations and opportunities of women and men. And women are excluded from some decision-making processes, of some opportunities. Men struggle with very strict and unrealistic expectations about masculinity and adopt different coping mechanisms. So I think there's a mission for the schooling system, education training system, to contribute to the changing of the world. And I think it's a week ago, or more or less, there was the International Education Day, and Nelson Mandela was cited several times in social media with his statements that education is the most powerful weapon that you can use to change the world. And I think today we see that in the political context of Europe, how education and the schooling system can be used to influence people's minds, opinions, and beliefs. So in the same way, we can use the education and training and schooling system to promote concepts on gender equality, undermine the gender stereotypes, raise both men's and women's awareness of the gender biases, and raise awareness about the advantages of more inclusive societies. So I finish on that point. For example, the EU has several programs in the Eastern Partnership for promoting skills, for supporting youth, you name it. And then you have a program, EU for Gender Equality, and its aim is to strengthen, of course, the equal rights and opportunities for women, but by shifting the social perceptions about gender roles, tackling the gender stereotypes, and increasing, men's and participation in childcare and other domestic responsibilities. And we tend to see this as something, these are the soft policies, they're not so important. So if we need to cut the budget, we cut it from this kind of programs. But actually, these are cornerstones for changing the society and having this more transformative approach to promoting gender equality, if we want it.
Thank you, Outi. I mean, I have to say it's fascinating what you're saying. Some points really that resonated with me is this idea that sometimes I think we're asking too much of our young people, of young women, and I understand why it's so important to have this ecosystem of support. I would just turn to Daphne, but before I do, we have some others who have joined us. We have Abdi from Turkey, we have Monia from Tunisia, and we have Mentor from Albania. Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us. Daphne, just as a final point, and also leading on from what Outi has said, and maybe a bit of a provocative question, but we see, you said earlier that a cultural shift is needed, and also Outi mentioned that we need really a transformation. So, but do you think that how can we overcome instances where this might seem like a conflict, create a cultural conflict? Do you think that, because even within the European Union, we have a lot of disparity, a lot of different cultures and societies?
Yeah, that is a very difficult question to answer. I think, and now I'm really talking on my own sort of from my own perspective, from my personal point of view, and not so much maybe evidence-based, but we have been talking about cultural stereotypes, and I think it's important that we also understand that these exist between societies, but also within societies. And I can only think of examples of young women, maybe even a very extreme example that I'm now going to mention, but Afghanistan, of course, where the situation is now really bad, but where women are also demonstrating for their rights. So, and that's in an extreme situation, but sometimes I think that particularly in situations or in countries where the situation seems rather okay, people also become a bit complacent. So we also seem to assume that everything is quite okay. I think it really goes for women, but also, for instance, for people with disabilities. Yes. On the one hand, it looks like we've come a long way, and we have come a long way, but we keep hitting this sort of ceiling. And if we look at the same, look at the gender employment gap, but you can also look at the disability employment gap. And for some reason, we get to a certain level and then we don't get further. And I really don't have the $1 million question answer to that. Except to say that cultural stereotypes that we all have, it's also part of human beings to have them.
Yes.
But I think we just constantly need to be reminded of them. I think that's really, some people might think, oh God, there they go again, but you have to be reminded of it.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe if
please.
I can say one more thing, it's also not the right time to be complacent, because we are dealing also, aging, and in a way, we're getting to stages where women have to work.
Yes.
And so it becomes a bit a strange discussion, but I think, and not between us, by the way, and this fact that on the one hand, we need this female workforce, and that's part of the reason also why a lot of attention is paid to the topic, but we can't have it without ensuring that then there is really equal pay, and that there's no discussion about that. And that when you come for an interview, you don't look at whether your name is female or whether your name is from a different ethnic background, and you name it. We keep having stereotypes.
Okay, thank you, Daphne. And just before I address this final question to Outi on the same issue, I will just say hello to Kaiser. I hope I've pronounced it properly, from Pakistan. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Outi, a final question before we wrap up. Also thinking of this cultural shift that's needed, what would you say to those who argue against equal opportunity because of this reason, because it challenges societal norms?
Well, I think one of the arguments that is used, and sort of a neutral argument, is the economic factors. So what Daphne just mentioned about, we need the women to work. We can correlate equality with the GDP. Yes. In around the world almost. So the GDP growth of a country where women are more educated, participate in the society at an almost equal level. There's no equal level anywhere. Have a higher growth rate, and this, of course, then has repercussions on the society overall, consumption, blah, 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 blah. We can see also that at the enterprise level, organization level, where more diversity, even in the the arguments about that the companies that have gender balanced boards, they actually make higher profits or all on the financial markets. So these are some kind of arguments that should work around and in every culture to some extent. Money is not everything that counts. Something that I always think when working with different countries, that at least our partner countries, they all have signed the Declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that promotes the equal right to education for men, women, lifelong learning. And this is from 48, I think, if I'm not wrong. And they have signed the CEDAW agreements and so on. So I think it's a discourse that, cultures change, but then let's look at the face. If in 48 or when you signed the CEDAW agreement, you committed your country to this, if it's not the case anymore today, let's discuss it and say it openly, but not at the moment when we're really discussing the micro implications in society in certain groups. So this kind of fakeness to some extent in some cases is something that, of course, you would not say fakeness in your diplomatic discussions, but we do have international commitments. So I would say, to conclude from my side, it's the economic arguments, international commitments, and the overall good positive effects of equality that can be seen in different countries for the overall benessere.
Yes, well-being of humanity. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Outi and Daphne. It was a fascinating discussion and insightful to hear your expertise on this topic. I'll say hi to Refik from Bosnia and Inga from Georgia, and thank a mentor who has said congratulations and good luck. Yes, also from me, thank you so much for sharing with us all your knowledge. We look forward to having you here again. I would just also say to our viewers that if you want to know more about youth and gender and skills, the ETF will have an event, How to Create and Use Evidence for Youth and Gender Inclusive Labour Markets, on the 23rd of February. And my colleagues have posted a link in the chat. And just to sum up then, this live discussion today, we started on the theme, considering the theme of work-life balance, inclusion, skills development, and gender. And we focused in on gender. Can skills help? Can they help this work-life balance inclusion, especially for those who are disadvantaged and have become more disadvantaged due to the COVID pandemic? And I think the answer, we can all agree, the answer is skills can help, but not by themselves. We need an ecosystem of supporting measures and a cultural and societal shift. So I thank you again, our audience and our guests today, Daphne and Outi. Thank you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.